O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy...
Welcome to the King's Hand in History podcast. I'm Chris Van Dusen.
And I'm Casey Hoost, and we're here to proclaim the King's glorious deeds.
On this episode, we are going to discuss the colonization of the mid-Atlantic colonies in North America. Those colonies that were settled mainly by the English that would later become the 13 American colonies that would form the infant United States during and after the Revolution. So we are stepping back. Last time we talked about John Bunyan. We are now going back in the 1600s, so the early 1600s, as John Bunyan was in the mid to late 1600s. But so we're going back in the situation in Great Britain in the early 1600s. There was much oppression for those who were not in compliance with the Anglican Church. And Casey, can you remind us which monarch during the time of the Pilgrims was in charge?
So it was Charles the First. Actually, the very early ones would have... right when the Pilgrims went, it would have been James, but not for very long.
Oh, that's right.
But down in like Virginia, Jamestown being named after King James the First. But by the time we really get into descent from the Puritans and the great migration to New England, I mean, you have a lot. I think they estimated like 20,000 between in the 1630s. You know, right before the English Civil War. That's when Charles the First has decided he's going to do things without Parliament and just doing what he wants. And you get a lot of Puritans at that time. They're very concerned and thinking tyranny is happening. Let's get out, and they go to New England.
Right. Already having the precedent of the Pilgrims.
Yep.
Already settling there. But before the Puritans, we have Jamestown. The year for that was 1609.
I believe so.
Okay. Yeah. So Jamestown is more an economic venture, right?
Yeah.
To get mainly tobacco resources. I'm sorry. We should probably even go before then to the first exploration of North America with Hudson and Champlain and the Spanish. So obviously, there's you have way before then, as most people know, you have the exploration of Christopher Columbus in 1492, sailing the ocean blue. So he discovers the so-called West Indies in the Caribbean, and there's Spanish settlements there in the Caribbean island region, and probably the eastern coast of Mexico. I would guess.
Yeah,
right?
Think about like Cortez going down and going through the Aztecs,
right,
and taking Tenochtitlan, which was Mexico City.
Yeah.
So yeah, they pretty much had. Actually, they drew a line because the Portuguese were pretty involved too.
All right.
Where the Portuguese ended up with Brazil and basically everything west of that, the Spanish. According to the Pope, like the Pope drew the line for them.
Right. And I remember from my history in school, there were three main motivations: God, glory, and gold.
Yeah. Hopefully in that order. No.
Yeah. So it's because Christopher Columbus, I don't know what you think about his motivations, but from what I've heard he was a pretty zealous Catholic, and he wanted to convert convert whoever the natives were to Christianity. That was from what I've learned, that was his primary motivation. Obviously, there were rich natural resources, especially gold in the South American region.
Yeah, I would call Christopher Columbus a very nuanced
individual
that has gotten a lot of conversation, and there's a lot you can say about him. Like we could do a whole podcast on him. Not that we have to, but
So the American exploration and colonization really began with the Spanish and it was Portuguese because he sailed from Portugal, I believe.
No, he was Ferdinand and Isabella sponsored him.
Oh, okay. So with the Spanish.
But basically,
and the Portuguese.
It's a little bit later on that North America, where we're kind of focusing on, is more explored. I think
a century later.
Yeah, and you get the English and the French, who are a little bit late to the game. Like Spain's already got most of South America and Central America.
I'm not sure if they had most of it.
Well,
I don't think it would because it's huge. I
mean, according to their maps and what they've not conquered but claimed, I guess you would say, and that like to go down there, you would be potentially fighting a war if you're looking to just stake a claim. But so you still have North America, and you have the English and the French. You have the Dutch. You have the Swedish a little bit that are sending their explorers. And you mentioned like Henry Hudson, Samuel Champlain. You have Cousteau. I think it's Cousteau. Anyway, that are exploring this, and they start to map it out a little bit. North America, yeah. Right,
and that's in the early 1600s, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Really early.
Oh, and probably some of the 1500s too.
Like turn of the century.
Yeah.
Turn of the century. So by that time, Florida is probably settled by the Spanish already.
Yeah. St. Augustine was founded in 1565.
Part of Florida.
And that was largely founded to control the Gulf of Mexico.
Right.
And so yeah, and actually the first colony is Roanoke in the 1580s. By the English.
Yeah, and that's in modern day Virginia.
Yep. I think it was an island.
Right, but didn't that something happen?
Yeah, no, there's a lot of mystery with that.
It's mysterious somehow. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, basically, they left a settlement there, and they came back like a year or two later, and like everybody was gone, but there was no indication. It wasn't like, it didn't look like there were no bodies. It wasn't like, didn't look like sickness had struck. It didn't look like they had fought any wars. They're all just gone. So that's kind of just an enduring mystery of what happened. And so that
I wonder if they were taken as slaves for the Native Americans.
Be fitting.
But that's my speculation.
Okay.
Go ahead.
And so actually, the Native Americans would often capture. Like if they captured villages of people, they would turn them into Native American, the younger people.
Right.
They would assimilate them.
Exactly.
Which was an interesting strategy, actually. Like the Iroquois, that was their big thing, is they would go after other villages so they could take their children.
But just for people who are ignorant, explain who the Iroquois are.
So the Iroquois Indians, people usually think of them as the 5 tribes of like New York that banded together. New York State, like upstate New York.
Yeah.
But they did, at the time when this exploration was happening, they were kind of the powerhouse group of Native Americans in North America. They had well up into Canada, was considered their territory, all the way down, I think, to Tennessee, and like west into the Ohio Valley. And one of their big tactics was, if they took a village, they'd just take all the kids and make them into Iroquois. So that was how they kept their numbers of warriors growing.
Well, that's. I wonder how many kids were assimilated like that. That's.
I don't know, but
that's really. I mean, that's. I don't think I ever learned about that.
Yeah, which is, and the thing too is with their culture. I guess the way they fought, that was not uncommon. So if you were a kid and you were captured, just like, okay, I'm an Iroquois now. It was just accepted, which seems strange to us now.
I mean, it would be interesting to see a white person among them.
Yeah.
Of course, they did wear the paint.
Yeah, and it's also, from my understanding,
and the dress.
If if a white girl is taken, the English, is a big thing to protect your skin. They wanted to look white and pure because that was attractive for the English. But so if you're an Indian, hats off, the bonnets off, all that stuff. Like you're out in the sun, and you do seem more red skinned after a little while.
I guess you do.
I guess the hair would have been the difference though. A lot of Native Americans have a very black hair usually, and then you're like looking, you're like, your hair's kind of red.
Yeah.
But yeah, it would have been interesting to be going into a Native American village and seeing English Indians.
So we have the exploration of Hudson, Champlain, and whoever the other guy was.
Yeah, I'm sure there were more too.
So they basically they scout out the northern New York area, and obviously the Canadian area.
And at this point, they're looking for, well, a couple things. One is they're literally just like charting maps,
right?
And a big reason is they still think they're going to find a way through a passage
to get to Asia.
Yeah. And that's what, like, Henry Hudson kept going. He thought he made it when he got to the Hudson Bay, which is not even close if you look at a modern day map.
Right.
But that's what they were trying to do.
Yeah.
But they're getting more maps, and then back in England, you have these people that are thinking, all right, maybe we can use this for resources, and you start to have this idea of colonies to provide raw material to the mother country under the economic idea of mercantilism. A lot of people misconstrue this to think that we're in a capitalist age now, but we are not.
Right. So can you explain the difference between mercantilism and capitalism?
Poorly. So basically, mercantilism, and forgive me if I'm off a bit here, but like I said, a lot of it's natural.
It's state sponsored.
Yeah, that's the big difference. Is that the
state, have private corporations.
The state controls it, and it's for the state to try to win at trade.
Right, and we have to also remember, obviously, that these nations that are sending out explorers and colonies, they are monarchies. They're not republics or democracies.
Yeah, correct. And so basically, like I said, I think it's the point of mercantilism is for the state to win at trade, to be getting more than it's to be receiving more value than it's sending out.
Yeah. Right.
Whereas capitalism, you get the laissez-faire, let it be. If we let the people do it on their own, it will end up winning for everybody.
Yeah.
But so, they start up these colonies with the idea that they will send raw resources back to the mother country.
Yeah, and the first nation in North America that does this is France, right? With Canada. Did the French colonies in Canada come before Jamestown?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure, but they were a different type of colony. The French didn't do this quite the same. Like, they were more like set up some outposts,
right?
Outposts where they would trade, and they never sent a mass amount of people over there. They weren't working the land. They just sent these fur traders over and they got way further inland than the English did for a long time. Like, they were going west, but it wasn't very many, and they just find Indians and trade with them. And they consequently had a really good relationship with Indians. Yeah. As we get to the French and Indian War in the 1750s and 60s, almost all the Indians side with the French.
Yeah, okay. So the very little French people, that they do have small trading outposts in Canada and probably northern New York.
In Canada as well. And even like ranging out into the Midwest.
Okay. Yeah, I remember that.
And also New Orleans. So I don't know when that was founded, but like Louisiana at some point becomes, as they come down and they trade from there down the Mississippi.
Right. And then in 1607 or 09 was Jamestown.
I think it's 09, but I could be wrong on that.
I think I'm remembering it's 09. So Jamestown is a state-sponsored venture, right?
Yeah.
That is, but it was basically just the king who sent that group out, basically, kind of funded them.
Yeah, it was I'm trying to remember the different types of charters, but yeah, this was by the king, by the crown, and with the idea that they would send resources back. And they get there, and I remember hearing the numbers on it. It was bad, like for survival rates.
Right.
It was something like they came of like the first few years of the 8,000. I think like something like 1,500 survived.
And there were no women, right? If I'm remembering my study correctly.
Ooh, that's a good question.
At the first, at least the first.
It may not have been
the first voyage. I think.
No, I do remember.
There were no women.
I do remember reading about how, in general, in the colonies for the first several decades, there was a massive like man to woman ratio in general.
You mean
way more men than women,
right?
And that this was kind of an issue for several decades. I think it was like 20-1, early on.
Yeah.
So anyway,
well, Jamestown, just for what I studied about it recently, most of the first people there were probably nominally religious Anglican church members, because there's a famous story. This man named John Eliot, he was basically the only pastor among them, and the rest of them were kind of basically they were actually kind of a lot of them were aristocrats or they were wealthy people that were used to comfortable living. And
at first or later on?
Yeah.
Okay.
So this trip was quite an ordeal for them, and they were complaining all the time. And John Eliot, their preacher, didn't complain at all. He lost basically everything but his clothes when they arrived shortly after they arrived, and he didn't complain. And he was preaching the gospel to them, and so he was a godly example. But unfortunately, he died.
Like most of them.
Yeah, he died not too long after they arrived. I don't even think he survived one year over here.
Yeah,
but he was
not uncommon.
He was a faithful preacher for them. Unfortunately, Jamestown, I don't believe, became a very godly society. But what was the fate of Jamestown?
So at first they had to keep getting more people brought over from England to keep it going.
Yeah.
And basically it struggled. John Smith, think of like the old Pocahontas story, where he's in by the Indians and she comes out and falls on him to rescue him.
John Smith was basically the leader.
He was
right?
the leader, and it was a pretty crucial time.
And he was like a military.
Yes,
he was a military officer.
And actually, I remember reading his stories about it, which were basically like advertisements to the people in England that they need to come, because is like, if you read them, you'll laugh. I mean, just basically he says how he got captured by the Indians and he fought them, and it was like him versus a million people alone, and he fought them off by himself. He used his Indian guide as a shield, and they had 3,000 arrows in that guy by the end because he used them, and then they were about to kill him, and he's like, hold on, let me, and he pulls out his compass and he explains the workings of the world to the Indians, even though they speak different languages, and they're like amazed, and they think he's a god, and like this. So this is what he's sending back to England to be like, see how amazing this is. But so basically, he rules them for a while. It's not. It's really when John Rolfe, I think it's Rolfe, maybe it's,
that sounds right.
figures out the tobacco thing. That suddenly tobacco takes off, and Jamestown becomes very wealthy because of tobacco.
And tobacco takes off because of the example of the Native Americans. They were already smoking it, right?
That's a good question. I don't know,
because I've never studied that before, but that would make a lot of sense to me, because I remember there were things called you have the peace pipes that they would smoke together to show that they had something in common, right? That sounds right. I don't think they smoked before then. Tobacco is not a native European.
Yeah, that'd be something to look up to see.
Thing I don't believe.
But anyway, it definitely took off, became a cash crop, where that became more like, in Virginia, we're going to grow a lot of tobacco and we're going to make a lot of money off it. Though I would say, speaking of money, most of these people were terribly in debt. I mean, they were borrowing, basically, since the crown was funding them. They're basically taking more and more money from the crown, being like, yep, and it becomes this pattern of, with each time you take tobacco, it's just to keep up with our debt payments.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of, which is important going forward, especially as you see like the founding of our nation, that this whole like rich aristocratic society is like founded on debt.
Right.
But
so how did Virginia develop?
Like
into a colony itself?
Yeah, so
shortly.
I would say too that they developed the House of Burgesses
Their
before,
government.
and not to take away from the Mayflower Compact, but this is before that.
And the House of Burgesses was a republic.
Yeah,
Republican form?
it was still
elected officials.
people
It was
like
kind of
to
like
say-
a parliament, basically.
Yeah, and basically because, and you have this with all the colonies, is England's 3,000 miles away.
Yeah.
And regardless of what England tells you to do and who's in charge and stuff, when they're 3,000 miles away, you have to
Govern yourselves.
Yes, and so yes, they start to do this. They have the House of Burgesses, which, like you said, I believe is kind of a republic. It's not really not quite democratic exactly, but more so than most any place in the world at that point. And so yeah, they're getting wealthy on tobacco. They do have their own self-government. They are sanctioned by the king and supposed to send them resources, and that's I think we can probably that pretty much covers them, and I think we can move up towards New England now.
Yeah. So in 1620 is when they sailed, but before then, forgot when it was. I think it was the year before, or a couple of years before. So the Pilgrims, they lived in this smaller place in England. There was one church. They were separatists. They were the Puritans we've talked about in the past, that they didn't believe the Anglican Church was in conformity with God's word, with Scripture. So they formed their own independent congregation, with John Robinson being the pastor, and there was William Brewster, who eventually became an elder of the congregation, and there was a guy named John, actually another guy named John Smith, which is there are three famous people named John Smith.
Yeah. If you're not sure what a first name is at this time, just say John. Your chances of getting it right are like 80%.
Right. So John Smith, he went with them as well. He formed a separate congregation. So they were undergoing persecution because of the laws of conformity or uniformity. Yeah, uniformity. You were not allowed to have an independent church separate from the Church of England. Above, I think it was above 5 people. So they were some of them, I believe, were arrested. They were persecuted, basically, mistreated by the government. And so they decided, after dealing with this for a while, they needed to go to a place where they could have freedom from the king, from the government, and worship God as their consciences saw fit. And so they thought the best place would be Holland, where there was some. Well, actually, obviously, Holland was a citadel of Calvinism, and they were Calvinists. So that would make sense. Also, the Netherlands at this time was a republic, having just won freedom from Spain. And actually, on that note, I should mention that already at this time, I think it was it was the early 1600s at some point, that the Dutch had already gone over to what is now the island of Manhattan and settled.
Yeah. So the Pilgrims, I think, settled a few years before.
Oh yeah, okay.
I think we
I
said
don't
it was.
think so.
I thought we looked it up, and I thought it was 1625 that New Amsterdam was founded.
Yeah, it was
16. A couple years before that there were settlements there.
Okay. Huh. Okay. Maybe. Yeah, you might be right. It was at least the early 1600s, but I'm thinking that they were there already. If not like an established colony, they were there for trade, because at that point trading. the Dutch were one of the most powerful and active European nations that were engaging in trade in the New World. They had obviously they were very good shipbuilders and seafarers. So but you can look that up. Actually, we'll just continue with the Pilgrims. So the Pilgrims go to Holland, and they're there for like a year, I think. But they find that their children are adopting Dutch language and Dutch culture, which according to the Pilgrims' opinions, the Dutch were actually, for the most part, ungodly. Which is interesting when you consider the fact that a lot of the Dutch were ostensibly Calvinists, and they followed the religion of Calvin, yet they had this reputation for being ungodly. But the Pilgrims, on the other hand, were reputed by the Dutch to be very godly, very faithful people. But the Pilgrims decided, we can't stay here any longer because our children are being corrupted, basically, by the Dutch. And so they thought, there's a place over there. They had heard of Jamestown being founded, and so there's land over there where they could start a new life apart from European society, and be pure, live purely, and follow God faithfully. And so they make a deal with is it the East India Trading Company?
Might be.
I think that's what it was. It was a trading company that would fund voyages to the New World in exchange for resources or money back to them. It was like a charter that they drew up.
And they actually made a deal with Virginia.
Oh yeah,
they were supposed to be part of Virginia and make another area there, but then when they land up in Cape Cod, they missed.
Although and it was actually, surprisingly enough, it was with the permission of the king that the Pilgrims were allowed to leave, even though the king was opposed to Puritanism. Yeah,
he permitted them, and like I said, it was supposed to be as part of Virginia.
Yeah,
they're going to be part of that colony, and they landed in Cape Cod. And note too that they left, I think, in September, started sailing, so they get to the New World in like November, I think. And so as they're then they get back in the boat and try to go south, and it's not going to work. So they just basically, then they think they draw up the Mayflower Compact that we're going to stay here with their general agreement of how we're going to function. And they were not, I think it was for 30 or 40 years that they were actually an unsanctioned colony. Like, just that they were supposed to be with Virginia, but they weren't.
That's right.
And then I think maybe in like around 1650 they got merged with Mass Bay.
Okay. But so the first winter, I think like half of them at least die.
Yeah, a lot of death
when they're over here. But they stay there for quite a long time until. It's a permanent colony until I think the mid 1600s. But they basically start the English presence in the area of New England, and they obviously encounter Native Americans, and they actually make a deal with one of the tribes.
Their encountering of Native Americans is. Where they landed, there had been a village.
Right.
But disease, and that can't be overstated too, the effect of disease from Europe coming to the Native Americans. There's estimates that 90% of the Native American population died off from disease within the first several decades of contact with Europeans. Yeah. So you just constantly have this ripping through the Native Americans, and as you find settlements like here, they get there and it's an abandoned village. Mm-hmm. It's just everybody there died a few years back. They said
the buildings weren't still there.
No, it's not like there's buildings, but there had been a settlement. Yeah. And then also as you go forward and there's battles between the Indians and the settlers, what you got to factor in that a lot of the Native Americans have dealt with disease, that they're already a weakened group. Mm-hmm.
Although they didn't have firearms.
Not at first. I mean, they traded for them.
Right.
But yeah,
eventually.
Yeah. Basically, you take this culture of the Native Americans that didn't have firearms, didn't have metal. Mm-hmm. They were fighting with sticks and stones before the Europeans came over, and so little bit of an advantage for the Europeans, I guess, when they're fighting.
Right. So the Plymouth colony, they call their settlement New Plymouth. They befriend. It was Squanto, right?
Squanto was, I think Squanto was the initial one, but then I think it was Massasoit who was like the chief. And actually, they keep so even as things got more and more concerning for Massasoit, he lived till like 1662, I think, and he kept the peace and an agreement with them until his death.
Right.
Even as like they were doing things to other tribes, there he was like, this is worrisome. I think, and then his son, I think, kind of broke away and wasn't happy with that. But
so yeah, so they have a friendly relation with at least one with at least one of the tribes, and because they're there, they motivate more Puritans of a different stripe later on, in the 1630s.
Yeah, the 1630s, like I said, this was before the English Civil War, when King Charles has decided he's going to go it alone without Parliament, and he's, enacting more and more what they would call tyrannical measures.
Yeah.
They're worried his wife is Catholic. They're worried he's going to institute Catholicism. So a lot of Puritans were thinking now's a good time to get out, and we have this place where we can go and have this this settlement, which will be just Puritan, where we can be a pure society.
Yeah. Well, mostly a pure church. Although,
yeah.
But the thing is, what I in my studies, what I read was that most of the Puritans that went over later on were not actually separatists or independents.
No,
they were okay with being part of the Anglican Church. They just wanted a pure church. They wanted a reformed Anglican Church.
You have two big waves. This first one was more the people getting out before, King Charles I was king. And after the Restoration, so you have the English Civil War, where Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans are basically in charge for a while. Then King Charles II comes back. He's restored, and he is not very kind towards Puritans. And so you have another big wave at that point. And I think at that point you get less... Like, before the war, you had more it was separatists that are thinking, like, let's get out. And whereas you have a lot of Puritans that stay and end up fighting... thinking like we can reform this, we can make it work. But after King Charles II got in, I think you have a more general feeling among the Puritans that the Puritan time in England is over, and you get less separatist, more mixed religious views
going over to the New World.
Yeah, after the Civil War.
Right. So the Massachusetts colony was the second phase of the Puritan immigration to the New World.
Right? Yeah, I'm not sure when that one was founded, but yeah.
Well, at least it was started being settled in the 1630s, right?
I think so.
Well, so at least mid 1600s. We'll say mid 1600s.
Yeah, it was definitely up by the mid 1600s.
It was a different place. It was Boston Harbor.
Yeah,
which is somewhat south, right? South of New Plymouth. I'm not sure. I think. Well, regardless, so Boston was the next major city in New England. Well, actually, if you can't really call New Plymouth a city, it wasn't much of a city ever. It never grew to much more than like a couple hundred.
And mind you, too, when you say a city at this time, like I think at the time of the Revolutionary War, so even jump ahead 150 years, I think Philadelphia was the biggest city and it had 30,000 people.
Yeah.
So as far as like how many people are in a place and calling it a city is much different than we think of today.
Right. But so you have a huge Puritan migration of thousands of Puritans.
I think I read in the 1630s they estimate about 20,000. Yeah.
And so they found the city of Boston under the first governor. What was his name? He's a famous guy.
Winthrop?
Yeah, John Winthrop.
John, of course.
Right. And so the way they actually set up their government as the Massachusetts Bay Colony, it is a state church.
And mind you, too, down in Virginia, also still the state church, the Anglican
Right, except
church.
they're Anglicans,
Yeah.
and and then you have the
Yeah,
Puritans.
yeah, they're
in Massachusetts.
They're different. Couple quick things on that. One being the leading up towards the separation of church and state that was founded in the U.S. Constitution. That actually a lot more of that had to do with the colonies having. Obviously they weren't happy with how it worked out in Britain, but then the colonies were almost all state. With the state and the church were tied to each other,
right?
And just general unhappiness with how that was working.
Except for Rhode Island, right?
Rhode Island
and Pennsylvania. I think.
So Pennsylvania was open, freedom of religion. William Penn was a Quaker, and then his family after him. So
we obviously need to talk about that.
And then Maryland also had a freedom of religion because it was a Catholic guy that founded it and wanted the Catholics not to get hurt. And then Rhode Island, was a different animal, kind of really independent in everything.
So actually, let's talk about that. So Boston is established in the mid 1600s, and from Massachusetts, you get Roger Williams, right? He came from the area of Boston, I think, right?
Yeah,
is that right? Yeah. So Roger Williams, he was university educated as a clergyman, I believe.
Yeah, speaking of universities, too. At this point, they're starting to set up some of the big universities in the U.S. that you still hear. Harvard, Yale.
I think Yale was later.
It may have been later. William and Mary was one of the really early ones down in Virginia.
Yeah.
And
these first universities, what was their purpose? Was it to train preachers?
It was like basically? Almost entirely to train preachers, yeah.
Right. And you get a lot of famous Puritan preachers that actually come over from England, like Cotton Mather is one of them. This is the only one I can think of. But back to Roger Williams.
Yeah, sorry.
No problem. I believe he's an Anglican, basically basically an Anglican clergyman.
Really? Up in New England, or was he Puritan?
I'm not sure exactly. Technically, they still consider themselves Anglicans in Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Okay.
I think, or at least like in that vein of following the general practice of the Anglican Church, although they wanted to purify it. But Roger Williams, he had some contentions with the colony. He didn't think that they should be chartered by the government, by the king. Was one of them. He didn't think that they should be sponsored by them.
I didn't study him too much.
Roger Williams. So he had 5 basic tenets. The Church of England is apostate, and any fellowship with it is disobedience to God, which the Massachusetts Puritans disagreed with. 2, the Massachusetts Charter is wrong to refer to King Charles as a Christian, because he didn't believe he was a Christian. 3, the colony should abolish its required citizen's oath, which forces unsaved people to pledge loyalty to Christ and to attend Lord's Day services or Sunday services. 4, civil magistrates should have no authority in spiritual matters pertaining to local churches, which is what the authorities in Massachusetts had. They had spiritual authority over churches, or to make decisions for the churches. And 5, the Indians are the rightful owners of the land. And so...
that's right, because he purchased the land in Rhode Island from the Indians.
And he was banished in 1635. Banished from Massachusetts for being a troublemaker. So he goes to Rhode Island, and he starts his own, independent congregation, which actually he leaves, he forsakes, because he thinks that they're impure. They're not pure enough for him, eventually, although he maintains friendly relations with them, especially with the Baptists. So some Baptists, I don't know whether the Baptists come over from England to Rhode Island, or that they're basically separatists from the Puritans in Massachusetts. But eventually they form a Baptist congregation there in Rhode Island. Rhode Island is established because of him going down there, buying the land. And so Rhode Island is established as a bastion of religious liberty because of Roger Williams. So you can freely practice any religion, by any religion, meaning any Christian religion.
Yeah.
Basically, because most of the people there are Christians, unless they're Native Americans. So that's the establishment of Rhode Island in the, I don't know, mid 1600s. After that, in the late 1600s, at some point, where should we go to next?
We should hit. We can talk about New York. I don't think we did that yet.
All right, you're right. New York. So we already said that the Dutch were there first on the island of what they called New Amsterdam. Amsterdam being the capital city of the Netherlands, and so they're there for trade. I think they majored in fur trading, if I'm not mistaken. So they have a colony there, and in 1664, the British.
Actually, if I may, before that, New Jersey is New Sweden. Like the Swedes tried to settle it a bit, but basically that was a failed effort. And I think through foreign wars, the Netherlands ended up acquiring that, and so New Jersey became part of the New Netherlands over there. Okay. And so when we get to 1664, that's when the English get it from the Netherlands. So go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, 1664. So the English have at least a few ships, because they see that the island is profitable for trading. And obviously, it's a good seaport.
And at this point too, I think they're looking at the map, seeing New England, down to Virginia. I'm not sure where the other middle colonies of Pennsylvania, but they're looking and they see this Dutch area right in the middle of them. Yeah. And thinking and the king actually, gave the order to be like, let's get the Dutch out of here.
Right. So they aim their cannons at New Amsterdam and say, the land is ours.
Yeah, and they didn't have to shoot them.
Right. But there's still, I believe that some Dutch still remain there until much later.
Yeah,
they still. I think they still allow them to live there. They're just taking it over. It now belongs to them. Now that the British can use it, and it's not until much later that a lot of the upstate New York is settled.
Though upstate New York, they did get inland a bit, just around the Hudson River. So basically, it just goes straight up in, and basically, I heard it described as you almost have like feudalism up there, where it's just like you get somebody that's wealthy that gets a tract of land and sails up there and sets up their own little kingdom.
Interesting.
Where it's pretty self-sufficient, and you're far enough away from everybody that you can send goods down the river down to what's New York now, so it's like kind of in between. We're up in New England, you just have these small little farms. It's not great growing conditions. Right. Down in the South, you get these big plantations, and in the middle colonies in like New York around the Hudson River, like I said, it's kind of in between. You have big enough that you have at this time it would be a lot of indentured servants to work it. But it's not this massive plantations. It's just pumping stuff out.
So let's talk about indentured servants, because that was a major part of the colonization. Of these colonies.
Yeah, I think probably the biggest area would have been Virginia for this. So basically, an indentured servant was if you were in Europe and you wanted to go to the New World, you would sell basically 7 years of your life. So somebody pays for you to go over there, but you work for them for 7 years, like in the fields. And this was initially their biggest source of labor. Think of the big tobacco plantations. And at first, this was a great deal for the landowners, because I think the average survival rate was 3 years when somebody moved over. So but as we go on, and the circumstances get better and people start living longer, it becomes a bigger problem for the Virginia landowners. When they get to the 7 years, they were also part of the agreement would be that they'd get some land, And so then they get to the 7 years and they're like, "Where's my land?"
Mm-hmm.
And they'd give them these crappy little sections. I was pushed back as far west as they could get them, and they wouldn't be happy. And you have a couple revolts by the indentured servants, and at this time, and already you have slavery starting with the African trade. I don't know if you've ever seen the map with the triangle.
Yeah.
With I think the slaves to the Americas, especially slavery really started off big in more in the Caribbean,
right?
But it did obviously work its way up into the current United States, and like rum going from the Caribbean and sugar, and then I'm trying to remember how it goes. But anyway, so the slaves are coming from Africa, sorry, and so you do start to get them in Virginia, and the Virginia landowners start to tend towards them because now that the indentured servants are living longer, better conditions, slaves a better deal. And then also these indentured servants are, with the revolts, are becoming problematic, and they start a bit, I shouldn't say start, but one of the things they do promulgate a bit of a racist theory to the lower class indentured servants, lower class white people, because they were very worried that the indentured servants and the slaves would pair up. And if they did that, they thought, we're in trouble. Like, if they revolt against us and we combine both their numbers. And so they really tried to push this idea to the indentured servants that, like, you are better than those black people. You are a higher class than them. And
not just a higher class, but a higher race of humans. Right?
And so obviously we see this idea is a terrible idea, very morally wrong, but the effects that this has for centuries.
Right. So that's indentured servants.
And about slaves too. Slavery never really takes off in the North. I mean, you have it, but you see it kind of by in the early 1800s. Most of the states have abolished it. It never really was that popular, and you think about it, it's because of the winters. That if you are going to own a human being and you have to take care of them, in the South it's easy. They build these huts and they can live there all year, but in the North it's cold.
Right.
Like you have to heat them, you have to all these things, so it just wasn't economically feasible.
Right.
So
so next colony, what do we want to go to?
We could talk about, we could work our way down. Did we talk about Pennsylvania yet? We should hit Pennsylvania.
We didn't. So William Penn is the founder of Pennsylvania. He was a Quaker. He was also the son of some important aristocrat or government official. He
was from a very wealthy family, so wealthy that when I think it was Charles II, so it must have been in like the 1660s or 70s that he got it, owed a lot of money to the Penn family, and his way to pay that off was to grant him the one of the largest tracts of land that I think actually when he got granted it, had the most land singularly of any person in the world.
Wow.
And so he is granted this land to pay off a debt from the king, and with this, as a Quaker, he wants religious freedom.
Yeah, because the Quakers were not.
And you still have a lot of Quakers, a lot of Anabaptists that still live in Pennsylvania.
Right.
But because it was just a haven for them all to come to.
Yeah, the Quakers too were persecuted, just similarly to the the Puritans.
They were persecuted. Obviously, we would disagree with their views.
Yeah, they were mystics.
Yeah.
They believed in mystical knowledge.
And it's actually interesting as they go forward, and like the western part of the state is dealing with Indian troubles and warring, and one of the big Quaker things was pacifism. And you have a Quaker leadership, and I remember reading one thing at one point where they actually admitted that, like, all right, so our beliefs probably aren't the best for governance. Just because, like, when you're getting attacked by Indians, you say, like, well, just don't do anything about it. And the people in the West are like, are you kidding right now?
Yeah.
And they realize that, like, it wasn't that their belief system didn't really fit with their current situation.
Right. So that's kind of basically Pennsylvania started off as just a safe place for various minority religious groups.
And in a similar vein, I kind of already mentioned, you have Maryland. which was founded by, and this again I think was a gift to a certain man.
Lord Baltimore. Right?
Yeah, and he was Catholic, and he wanted it to be a Catholic colony. But he found pretty quickly that there were a lot of Protestants, and so seeing the Protestants coming into his colony and doing the math a little bit on, I don't think that the Catholics will outnumber the Protestants. That's when he's like, all right, religious toleration for basically all Christians, so that the Catholics will always be able to worship as they want, was his goal.
Yeah, right.
So you have another colony that has this decree and ideal of a religious toleration among Christians.
It's diverse. You have Baptists, Puritans, Quakers, and Catholics. Mainly, I believe those are the main ones there. Maryland obviously it's because it's right on the sea. You have the seaport of Baltimore, which is very important. So they can do trading and get good goods there.
Oh, actually, something interesting I learned too about Delaware, that technically that was never a colony.
Really?
That it was part of the land that was given to William Penn.
Huh.
And so it was part of Pennsylvania, but basically he realized that it was weird because it's not even connected. That Maryland's in between, and he realized that we can't just basically let them set up their own government there, even though it was technically part of Pennsylvania. Which I learned that in the last couple of days. That's fascinating.
I kind of forgot about Delaware. Delaware's not in New England, right?
No.
Right. I've been there once.
South. It's right. So you know where Maryland is? It's basically just all captured within Maryland. Just this little spot of land.
Although isn't Delaware? It touches the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah.
So the beach there.
Yeah. So picture if Maryland's almost the letter C.
Right.
And within that, Delaware is kind of sitting in there, and everything else is ocean.
I think it's a backwards C, like that. Isn't it?
Well,
whatever.
If I'm confusing you, forget this.
Delaware doesn't really play much of a important role. It's kind of a nobody.
If you live in Delaware,
you have one good beach that I've been to, but I can't remember even what.
No, it's actually a very nice place to be. Is it Rehoboth, or is that in Maryland?
No, it's not Rehoboth.
Bethany.
All right, it might be Rehoboth. I think it is Rehoboth.
I'm always confused when we go down there because it's I'm in Maryland and then I'm in Delaware and I'm not sure where I am.
Right. Anyway, let's move on to the deep South colonies.
Yep.
The Carolinas. How were they?
Yeah,
founded?
so they were founded. They were named after Charles. This would be Charles II. Caroline being the female version of Charles.
So why? Why were they called? Why were they switch it to?
I don't really know.
Feminine type.
I don't know.
Okay.
That's an interesting question. Really, it's interesting that they named them like that.
Yeah.
You pointed out. But so at first it was just one colony. It was Carolina.
Although they did have the city of Charlestown.
They did, which was also
directly named after.
which was named after him. And they knew this was down more in an area where you could cash crop grow things, and I believe the two big ones were rice and indigo. But obviously, at some point, I think we looked it up. It was the early 1700s that North Carolina and South Carolina split for a variety of reasons. There was disagreements between the two sides. North Carolina was fairly far from Charlestown. There were a couple of little Indian wars, which put them in different positions, I think.
And just go back to their cash crops.
Yeah.
Obviously, rice is for eating. Indigo is, some people may not know, that's for dyeing clothes, right?
Yeah.
It's a bluish color.
And again, it's just kind of a little reminder that their point is to provide resources to England.
Yeah.
And so that's why they're like, you're going to grow indigo because this can be useful to us, and especially in the textiles and the wool industry.
Yeah.
Let's see. And so, there's not... Oh, I would say too for the South, Charleston is a large city. I mean, comparatively, but besides that, in the North, you have many more cities, and in the South, it's much more spread out. Right. It's a lot easier to travel. So if you have this plantation, you're much more likely able to just send it down a river and down, and be able to just send it from wherever. You don't have to send it to this point of like New York City. Everything has to go through New York City. You don't have that.
Yeah.
And so it's just a much more spread out rural area. There's less schools. There's less, it doesn't have that Puritan where like a lot of people want the focus to be religion. And so also as you go right up from the south up into Virginia would still be considered south, and Pennsylvania a bit, you also have this group of people that move in and that are very independent. I mean, you get in the Appalachia, you think of the Scots that get there.
Yeah. Scots Irish, right?
Yeah, yeah, like
combination of Irish and
basically
Scottish.
like the Celtic people,
right?
And they are very independent. They get in,
Right.
They get far enough in where they can be like, there, nobody should be able to tell us what to do.
Yeah.
And they get upset whenever anybody tried to, and even if they tried to, how are you going to force them to do it?
Yeah.
And so that's all along, like, as far west as they can get, which really at this point isn't that far west if you look at a map. But for most of the places being on the coast, and then it's wilderness. So you do have that going on. And then moving south, the last colony made was Georgia. And this was originally founded by James Oglethorpe. The idea was kind of a penal colony, a rehabilitation place, a place for outcasts, where they thought like we'll be able to grow, basically have this resource center where we're growing things, and it also helps people.
For prisoners, right?
Prisoners was one of the groups. They were more than I thought.
Okay.
Boy, I forget which. It was poorly planned out though. They first of all, the cash crop they decided to grow, I'm trying to remember what it was. It was not something that you can grow in Georgia.
Huh.
And so they failed miserably.
Was it tobacco?
No, it wasn't tobacco. Hold on.
Sugar cane?
I don't think so. Give me 1 second. I want to look this up. So after like 20 years, it just kind of gets turned into a more regular colony.
Silk.
Yes, that's what it was. So they wanted their cash crop to be silk, and it was just failed miserably because that's not a spot for silk to grow. And so after about 20 years, I almost want to say the crown just like took it back because it's realized that like this is not working at all. We're not getting any silk out of you.
Right. But Georgia was named after King George, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was, like I said, it was a later one. So
same King George that was king during the Revolution.
No, I would think it would be probably George the First.
Oh, okay, that would make sense. So we have basically all the colonies that made up the 13 colonies. We failed to mention many of the New England ones.
Yeah, well, we kind of group them all together there.
But they're united by the early 1700s. They're united by at least a few things: religious liberty, because they're so diverse. They're allowing religious freedom. You don't have to be an Anglican person over there. United by self-government, because they have to govern themselves in being so far away from.
And I would say too on that and this was part of the reason that caused the revolution was for over 100 years, England basically just left America alone.
Yeah,
it didn't really give them many laws. If it did, it didn't really mean them. There was no enforcement of them, and America was able to, the American colonies, I should say, were able to do what they wanted. They rule themselves. If they get some initiative from the mother country, if they want to do it, cool. If they don't do it, there's no repercussions. And so then after the French and Indian War, when England starts like, all right, we got to really try to do some stuff here, the colonists were not happy about that because they're like, no, you're 3,000 miles away. And it's also, if you think about them being 3,000 miles away, and it's a boat trip, so it's like a couple months. Like if the king says you have to do that, it's literally 2 months before any of them know about it. And this could be, think about trying to tell somebody that. And so, I think this alone just fosters this independence.
Right.
And also, a lot of these people, these are the types of people that that when given the message that you can go and found your new life in this wilderness, that go.
Right.
And so a lot of these people are rough.
Right.
I mean, they're the type that would go out and into the wilderness and try to make their own way. And so you have just this independent-minded people that's happy to go off into the wilderness, and that means they get to set their own religion. They get to set their own government, and nobody's going to tell them what to do.
Right. Unless it's God.
Yeah, unless it's God.
Right. For the most part, a lot of them were devout Christians.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that unites them is mostly Christianity. And also on the self-government thing, they're developing more Republican forms of government that are non-monarchical, because they're divorced from the king.
Well,
and they already
well,
have.
and it's also because they're in a unique situation to do it because they have a king,
right,
that they have to recognize. So you can't just set up another king. It's more like, we set up, and think of England. There's the king's in charge, but below him is Parliament.
Right.
And so it's kind of a natural thing to say, yes, the king's in charge, but we'll set up our own type of Parliament here.
Right.
So it's kind of set up uniquely for them to walk right into that.
Right. And they also see that Republican forms of governments work. It just worked with them.
Yeah.
To accomplish what they
when you have.
Want.
Yeah, when you have that many people that are complaining and coming from different ways to try to at least get it so that, you do have some type of say in the government. Yeah. I'm not just telling you what to do, because otherwise it'd just be revolts or people not listening and going off and doing their own thing. So you do need to include people in the government in this situation if you want them to recognize it.
Right. Yeah. Something I just want to note on that I did learn is that they had very severe penal codes, laws all throughout the colonies, even more severe than back in England. They were actually more strict on the way you lived than back in England.
See, and that makes sense to me.
At least in the beginning.
I mean, it's like the ship in the Navy. Like, it is very severe punishments because you're on a ship altogether. If somebody fails you could all die.
But back in the colonies, it was more severe because life was harder.
Yeah, well, and also it's like
that back in England.
You're just out over there together.
Right.
Your group here is all you've got. Right. That's what I was saying with like the ship is like you rely on each person here.
Yeah, probably tighter communities.
Yeah. Especially early on when they're first coming. And you think of like the Pilgrims or the Jamestown community.
Yeah, I think one major lesson we can learn from the original from the colonies, from the colonization. So we'll stop there. So next major event I would say is the First Great Awakening, in the colonies, because they're most of them they were devoutly religious, but there was a kind of a falling away.
Yeah,
I think, and a lot of them we can't exclude the fact that a lot of them were just nominal Christians as well, just like back in England.
I think you really see it. I think south of New England is a lot more nominal, but you think at least we've got the Puritans.
But even in New England,
that's what I was going to say.
It fell off with something called the Halfway Covenant, where church members who were outwardly religious could have their children become members of the church, because to be a member of the church was to be a participant in the government.
I remember reading one Puritan saying that he thought that maybe 1 in 7 New Englander was actually
a Christian.
Yeah. Right. I mean, so that gives you that, and then you if you go down south where you're deep into the back country of people that don't go to church because they can't even, they're like, the piousness and beliefs down there probably not as high.
Right. I think one thing, I don't know if I'm continuing with the thought I just had. One thing we can learn from them is to as believers is see what they accomplished with such great risk, going off into a world they had never known. And yet, at the end, they founded a nation, at least states that were advocated and enforced religious liberty, Christian values, and was a bastion of Christianity, especially after the first Great Awakening. So I think we need to be better risk takers. We need to be more faithful to our biblical convictions. We need to be willing to die for them, and they were. Especially
you look at the death rates; they were crazy.
Yeah, especially the Pilgrims. In order to live according to their consciences, according to God's word, they risked their lives, and also they did it together. They were like the first Pilgrims. It was communal living. Yeah. They were a family together, doing this for God's glory.
When you see the outline of when they got houses built, and you're like, oh, first of all, they're all on the ship together. Then they got the one building where they basically used it as a hospital, and that was their one building. I saw something that there were times in that first winter where they had only 5 or 6 people healthy enough to try to care for everybody.
Right.
And like,
it was deplorable conditions. But by God's grace, they got through it, and they established a colony, and I think they accomplished great things for the Lord, especially with the preaching of the gospel to the Indians. That's another thing that was accomplished through them. But I think we can stop unless you have a final one or two comments.
I'm good.
We can stop there. We got religious liberty, republicanism, and I think those are the two major things we can glean from the colonization of the colonies.
I guess you could say too to be mindful, because looking at the colonists, I don't think they intended to. I mean, you intended to hurt specific people groups, but now now people always point to the Native Americans and the slaves as people that the Americans really mistreated, and I think they did, but I don't think they intended to, and I think there's nuance to it. But I guess the personal lesson for us there is just to be mindful of how your actions affect others, and to be careful not to leave people that you accidentally hurt, that will be a stain on your testimony.
Right. Okay, with that, I think we'll leave it there. Don't know what we'll cover next episode, but we'll figure it out by God's grace. So thank you for listening to the King's Hand in History podcast. If you're on Facebook, we have a Facebook group you can join called the King's Hand in History Students. We welcome anyone who's willing to just be there, because we don't really have much discussion, but if you want to discuss, we'd be happy to do that. Until that next time, thank you for listening, and God bless.